The story of James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, is one of adventure, conspiracy, romance, heroism, treachery and tragedy. He was of royal blood, called a duke, treated like a duke, but his life had one fatal flaw, and that flaw can be seen on his coats of arms, a bat and sinister. He was illegitimate. The tragedy of his life was centred on the fact that his mother always said she was married to Monmouth's father, Charles II. And later in his life, Monmouth would become surrounded by dangerous adventurers and disaffected Whigs who cajoled him into believing he was the rightful heir, cajoling that finally led him into rebellion and ultimately to the block. Proof of the marriage of Monmouth's mother to Charles II was supposedly held in a black box that even in Victorian times was causing certain powerful people a few nervous moments. The story has also been the title of the novel The Black Box by W. Bourne Cook. In the second chapter, Michael gets to see the infamous black box. Chapter 2. The Secret of the Black Box. Sitting with his hands upon the box, as though 'twere something which might jump away, my father tapped it gently, saying, "That which I am about to show you, Michael, is what no eye, save mine, have seen except one other. Yours will make a third, which goes to prove how thoroughly I trust you." Unbuttoning his vest, he brought forth a curious-looking key, which hung by a narrow ribbon from his neck. With this, he solemnly unlocked the box, and having thrown the lid back, laid it upon the table. 'Twas lined with purple velvet, and so far as I could see, contained two separate papers neatly tied with silk. The undermost of these he took out first, and laid it on the table. "Read that," he said, "and tell me what you think of it." Greatly wondering, I undid the cord and scanned the contents of the paper. Then my hand shook, for this is what I read. "Know all men that our eldest and well-beloved child, James, Duke of Monmouth, is our rightful heir. In proof whereof, we herewith give the marriage contract between his mother, Lucy Walters, and ourselves, given at our palace of Whitehall, this 16th day of August, in the year of grace, 1679, Charles R." "Well, what do you think of it?" asked my father as our eyes met. "Why," I answered eagerly, "it proves exactly what I said, that Monmouth is the rightful King of England." "Ah, you say so," quoth my father grimly. "Now read this." This was none other than the marriage contract mentioned in the foregoing letter. 'Twas dated from Cologne, set forth every detail of the matter, and was also signed by Charles. "Well, and what now?" asked my father gloatingly, as I laid the parchment on the table. "Well, 'tis clear as any pikestaff," I replied. "Monmouth should be king without a question." "Ah, you think so," said my father shrewdly. "Small wonder either, but be not too hasty in your judgments, Michael. Now read that." Handing me the final paper with a glowing look of triumph, my father smiled. This writing was my father's well-known hand, and 'tis small wonder that I read it with amazement, for this is how it ran. "I, Gilbert Fane of the Havering by Lyme, in the county of Dorset, writing with full knowledge of the matter, do hereby solemnly declare the documents inside this box to be rank forgeries. Gilbert Fane." When dumbfounded and bewildered, I raised my eyes from this amazing statement. 'Twas to find my father's fixed upon me with a hungry look. "Ah, and what now?" he asked, drumming the table with his fingers. For a moment I could find no words. Then, "Forgeries!" I fairly grasped. "Yes, rank forgeries," replied the old man grimly. "But, sir," I stammered, "'tis the king's own writing." "You are sure of that, eh?" "Yes, sure as death." "And why?" "Because I saw a letter from King Charles at Sir John Berkeley's house but a week ago. 'Tis framed and hangs upon the wall. And the writing is the same as that, I added, pointing to the documents. You have good cause for saying that, yet 'tis not so. Well, at any rate, two peas were never more alike. I remember thinking that the Charles looked more like Charlie, just as this one does. Yes, 'tis wonderfully like it. Ah, I am with you there, rejoined my father grimly. As you say, 'tis wonderfully like indeed, and why? Because 'twas written by a wonderfully clever man. And who was that? I asked point blank. One Robert Ferguson, replied my father slowly. What? The great Ferguson? I cried astonished. Great if you choose to call him so, came the answer in the same deep measured tones. But wicked, I should say. Ferguson the plotter. Here he raised his voice. Ferguson the traitor, liar, thief and hypocrite, as black a scoundrel as ever foot set upon God's earth. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, met his grisly end with his head on the block. Jack Ketch, who was to dispatch him, took 7 blows of the axe before removing the Duke's head. In fact, he had to finish the job with a small filleting knife. And so ended the doomed life of the Duke of Monmouth. His life had offered so much, yet how did he end his days in such a brutal fashion? Lucy Walter, the mother of James Scott, who was to become Duke of Monmouth, was described as a brown, beautiful, bold, but insipid creature. In 1648, Charles, Prince of Wales, whilst in exile, met Lucy Walter in The Hague and fell for her. A year later, a son was born. Charles from the start never denied that James was his child, and during the early life of James Scott, he would send Lucy funds to ensure that she and the boy were not destitute. In spite of funding Lucy, he never acknowledged the fact that he and Lucy were married at any stage. In 1651, Lucy visited London and was herself arrested on Cromwell's orders as a royalist spy. She was quickly bundled into the Tower of London. Whilst incarcerated in that frightening stronghold, she maintained her innocence and called herself the wife of Charles II. Whilst in prison, she had taken from her a precious black box which was removed for safekeeping. With it went her marriage lines. The Republican authorities soon realised, however, that having imprisoned a potential Queen of England, there was a public outcry. Within 3 days, Lucy and her maidservant Anne were released. They may have been set free unharmed, but the black box had not been returned to her. She was bluntly told by her guards on release, "Don't know anything about a box, madam. Best be on your way." But why was this black box and marriage lines so important? During the 1670s, the very idea of political parties was beginning to take shape. One of the main reasons for this was the battle for who was to succeed Charles II. James, Duke of York, the King's brother, or the Catholic Duke, he was supported by the Tories, and James, Duke of Monmouth, the Protestant Duke, supported by the Whigs. In 1681, Charles decided enough infighting had been done, and put his weight behind the Tories and his brother. This led to the Black Box Review to prove once and for all that Charles had never married Lucy Walter, and therefore Monmouth was not a legitimate successor. Charles II had lots of illegitimate children, but none with his lawful wife, Catherine of Braganza. In this great review, many witnesses stated they had no knowledge of a black box, yet there was still an unsettling number of people who knew of the marriage. There were some even who claimed they were eyewitnesses at the ceremony. Claim and counterclaim were made, and even bishops were found to be going back on previous statements, claiming they had seen the wedding documents. It was in these proceedings that someone even suggested that it was Cromwell himself who stole the documents whilst Lucy was in the Tower. After the Restoration of 1660, one of Charles's key opponents was the Whig politician Anthony Ashley Cooper, 1st Earl of Sharksbury. Sharksbury favoured Monmouth, the Protestant Duke, over Charles's brother James. Shaftesbury was the arch-manipulator, and was one among many who eventually egged Monmouth on into rebellion, making him believe that it was he who was the rightful successor to Charles II. Charles II became so distraught over the succession, and how it was tearing his family apart, that he was forced to make this public declaration, much to the shame and humiliation of Monmouth. For the voiding of any dispute which may happen in time to come concerning the succession of the crown, I do hereby declare, in the presence of Almighty God, that I never gave nor made any contract of marriage, nor was married to any woman whatsoever, but to my present wife, Queen Catherine, now living Whitehall. Charles R. In this clip from the first Churchills, we see Charles's true affection for his son, but also his ruthless desire to maintain the right of succession.
You, James?
Sir, these men wish you well.
Nay, if I do their bidding, they tolerate me, and I'll be no man's puppet. And beware, James, lest they make you one.
You choose to insult me.
Nay, I choose to keep you from folly. Now, there's a story being put about that a black box has been found. 'Tis said it contains a marriage contract between your mother and me. Have you seen such a contract?
No.
Nobody has, because it doesn't exist, but the Whig lords make great play with it nonetheless. Now, my dearest son...
Am I your son?
You know that I've ever claimed you to be and hold you most beloved above all my children.
Then do what the people desire.
Have you no understanding? If the principle of true succession be put aside, if a heir be elected by me or by any political faction, or if he be nominated by popular vote, then the monarchy itself will fall. For an heir thus nominated or elected may be dispelled by the same means. But take the Roman emperors, ponder their fate.
And think you, sir, of the condition of England, half republican even now. But if a Catholic should come to the throne, there will be civil war, anarchy.
Your uncle may grow wiser with time. He may die before me. Patience is the virtue of good government.
Nay, sir, 'tis the vice of all men.
Well, I could tell you of worse, but mark this. There will be no change in the succession. And to quell any doubts or rumours, a declaration will be published under my own seal tomorrow stating the clear truth, that at no time was I ever married to any woman save my wife, the Queen.
You do this to shame me.
Oh, James, nay, James, nay. I do it to keep you from infamy, danger. But let us be at ease with one another. Come sup with me tonight. There's a company of Spanish dancers fresh from the
Your Majesty will excuse me. I'm engaged elsewhere. Tonight I sup with my friends.
Like Shaftesbury, Robert Ferguson, previously mentioned in the Black Box novel, was a well-known agitator and enemy of James, Duke of York. He published an article stating that the inflammatory documents were in the possession of Sir Gilbert Gerard MP for Northallerton, who himself was a supporter of excluding James, Duke of York from the succession. Ferguson wrote that Gerard was given the documents by his father-in-law, John Curzon, Bishop of Durham. Near death, Curzon was said to have left instructions that the box was to be kept sealed until after Charles's death. However, Gerard, being human, apparently fell to temptation and looked inside. There it was believed he found proof that Curzon himself had married Charles and Lucy during the exile. Even before the Restoration, Lucy had attempted to get parish records which would prove she and Charles were supposedly married. Efforts were also made to question the clergyman who performed the ceremony. Unfortunately for Lucy, although fortunate for Charles, These parish records had been brought to Somerset House in London to be examined. There was a fire, and the records were destroyed, and the myth, along with any of Lucy's hopes, went up in smoke. Lucy's last roll of the dice, therefore, was the aging clergyman who had performed the ceremony, Dr. John Cousin. If this old man could be brought before a bench, and to swear on his oath the marriage had taken place, then disaster for many would follow. It would mean Charles would not have been able to marry a wealthy Portuguese princess, and it would mean James, Duke of York, would perhaps be removed permanently from the line of succession. Cromwell himself was part of the interrogating team when the old cousin was dragged in. Cousin was now living in poverty, and it was proven that his mind was wandering, and that his evidence could not be relied upon. On top of this, the authorities were to prove that Cousin had no ecclesiastical qualifications at all at the time, and therefore the marriage, if there was one, was null and void. The mystery of the black box continues to this day. Rumour and myths surround the story, and some tempting tales still haunt the memory of the Duke of Monmouth. The third Duke of Buccleuch, descendant of Monmouth, supposedly found a marriage certificate in a room at Dalkeith. He is reported to have said, "No Englishman should keep such a bombshell in his possession." He apparently burned it in front of the Duke of Abercorn. Another tale has the Duke showing it to Queen Victoria herself, who glanced at it and at once set it on fire. Did Lucy Walters marry Charles, who was later to become Charles II? If so, Monmouth would have been the rightful heir to the throne, and most probably the history of this nation, and perhaps the world, changed forever.